Hello, this is Enzyme back again, and in this video I want to show you how you can take pictures in Second Life. So my goal with this video is to try and be as comprehensive as possible within the shortest amount of time. So we'll be going through all the basic stuff very quickly, like what viewer you can use to take pictures, how you can pose your avatar properly, and I'll be going into more detail about how lighting works, so things like wing lights and point lights and projectors as well. And then we'll get into a bit more advanced stuff like post-edit effects and also how you can work around Second Life's depth of field effect. So whether Second Life photography is something that you're new to, or if you've been doing it for a while, there'll still be some useful information here for you. But we'll be starting with the very basics first, and then we'll be working our way up from there. I'll be leaving timestamps throughout the video, so if you prefer just to skip ahead to a certain section, you can. So the first thing we'll cover is what viewers can you use to take pictures. The short answer for this, in my opinion, is you can use any viewer you want. In terms of the image quality that you can capture in-game without using any post-edit effects, I would say that Black Dragon is probably the winner there. Black Dragon also gives you the option to save your camera presets, tilt the camera, and you can also use the built-in poser, which is very convenient. But keep in mind, these are also things that you can use in other viewers, not just Black Dragon. The only major difference across the different viewers, such as Firestorm and Alchemy, is that rather than using a built-in poser, you would have to use a third-party poser, such as Animair. But despite those limitations, it's definitely still possible to take nice looking pictures, especially if you're using a photo editing program like Photoshop. I do plan on making a video in future comparing the different viewers that you can get and seeing what the pros and cons are, although that's more for general use. But since we're focusing on photography here, I'll be using Black Dragon just to show you how to control the poser and the camera. Even though we'll be using the Black Dragon built-in poser, the idea of targeting the different joints on your avatar and changing the values to fit the pose, it will be the same even if you're using a third-party attachment such as Animair. But anyway, going forward, I'll be showing you how to work with Black Dragon. So what I've just done is I've reset my camera view, and you can do that by pressing escape. If I hold down the Alt key, you should see that my cursor will change into a magnifying glass. I can use either the scroll wheel or W and S on the keyboard to zoom in and out. If you press A and D or left and right on the arrow keys, that will change the rotation. And you can use either page up and down or C and E to change the camera orbit. So if I hold down Alt and then click on any object in the scene here, for example my avatar, that's going to focus the camera on that object, so then any movement controls that I do here, it will focus just on that point. If you hold Alt and then hold left click, what that does is it will become sort of like an active camera, so as you move the mouse left and right, that will rotate the camera, and moving your mouse up or down will zoom in and out. You can also use this technique to orbit the camera as well, so if I was to hold Alt and then right click on my avatar, if I start moving my mouse up the way, that's going to orbit the camera down, and if I start moving the mouse down the way, that will orbit the camera back up, and then you can also rotate it around as well. You can also do the same by holding down Alt and then Control. You'll see that the cursor will change into this rectangle with a circular arrow, and if you start using the arrow keys, the camera will orbit in the same way. If you open the Preferences menu by pressing Ctrl P, in this section here, Camera, there'll be a slider called View Angle. So the lower this value is, the more zoomed in the camera will get, and then the higher you slide it up, the more zoomed out it will get. And in Black Dragon, you can reset these sliders by pressing right click, and that works with any slider. You can also control this using the keyboard, so if you do Control 0, that's going to lower the value, and if you do Control 8, that's going to bring it back up again, and if you do Control 9, that will reset it back to its default. So what I normally do is I'll use the keyboard shortcut about 6 times, and then that will give me a good view angle for taking pictures. You can also use the camera tilt to get a better composition, so if you hold down Shift and then start pressing E, you'll see that the camera will start to tilt sideways. If you do this too much by accident, you can undo this by doing Shift, Control and then Q, and then that will reset back to its default angle. You can also save the camera's position by pressing Control Shift C. So if I press that and then move the camera somewhere else, if you press Control Shift V, that will bring the camera back to where you saved it. So if you have depth of field enabled, you might notice that if you focus your mouse on other areas in the scene, your camera will focus in and the depth of field will affect anything that's in the foreground here. So one shortcut that's good is Alt-Shift X, and what that does, it will lock the focus on whatever you selected with your mouse. So now if I start moving the camera around, it's still going to maintain focus on my avatar. And what I like to do is you can shift the camera just facing either to the left or to the right just slightly, and that gives you a slightly better composition if you're taking portrait pictures. You can also use something called free focus, so if you press Ctrl Shift and X, that will turn it on, and the way this works is wherever your mouse cursor is pointing, that's where your camera will focus to. So if I start moving it towards the background, it will focus in on this background area here, and then if I move it back to my avatar, the focus will come back onto my avatar. This isn't really something that I use personally, but I just wanted to show you that you can. So that covers everything about how to work the camera. So the next thing that I want to talk about very quickly is the graphic settings. So if we go into our preferences again by pressing Ctrl P, in the display section, what we're going to look at is the main graphic settings here. So what I like to have it set to is everything is very high except for the tree quality, and also I'm not sure what it's called on Black Dragon, but if FlexiPrims was to be shown here as well, both FlexiPrims and tree quality, I have that as low as possible, just because in my own experience I've never really seen a difference between low quality and high on trees or FlexiPrims, but everything else I'll keep that fairly high. So if you're using Black Dragon, you can actually control the rest of the display settings by using something called the Machinima menu. So if I close this and then press F1, it'll come out the side here. If you have Black Dragon installed, I'd recommend that you take a look at these in your own time, just so you can mess around with them. But what I'll be showing you in this video is just the things that I tend to use the most for taking pictures. These three boxes here control the advanced lighting model, so if you tick no shadows, that will turn the advanced lighting model off, meaning you won't be having any shadows cast across your scene like this. So I tend to keep this on with projectors. Depth of field, so when you toggle this off, everything will appear super sharp, and then when you toggle it back on, depth of field will be in effect, so anything that's in your foreground will be in focus, and then anything that's in the background will appear less focused. You might run into an issue where the depth of field doesn't work around your avatar's hair properly, but I'll be showing you a technique later on in the video as to how you can get around that. This box here where it says render world lights, you can see that at the moment I have it off. So what this means is the only light that we see in our scene right now, this is just coming from our wind light. The term wind light just comes from a code name that Second Life coined, meaning their atmospheric rendering system, which controls the lighting that you see right now. The actual feature called wind light got replaced by something else called the Environmental Enhancement Project. So basically what this means is that you're actually able to save your own presets. So if you come into your wind lights here, if you start changing things like the color of the sun and the direction of the ambient light and all that kind of thing, you can then save it into a preset, which then you can share it with other people or you can deploy it onto your own parcel. I just thought I would point this out because you might still hear people use the term wind light. That's just a term that we use, even though the actual new system is called something else, but in my experience most people still call it wind light. So anyway, there's only really one more thing that I use in this menu, which is near the bottom, and that would be the vignette slider. Vignetting is just a fancy word that basically means you're diminishing the border in your picture. So if I was to slide this all the way back down, you would see that there's now no more dark edges around the screen. And if I start sliding it back up, you can see that it becomes a lot more harsh and it almost forms this weird border. The vignette in Black Dragon is pretty strong, so I prefer to have this set to 0.3. So if I close the Machinima tab by pressing F1 and then toggle off my user interface by using Ctrl Alt F1, you can see that the picture we're getting is quite a clear picture and it's only got a very faint border, which is what I like to use. So there's one more setting that I want to cover very quickly, which is to do with the level of detail. If you have high specs in your PC, you might not have this issue, but otherwise, if you're running on low settings, what you might find sometimes is that the objects in your scene won't load in correctly. So I've actually just changed my settings to demonstrate this. So if you look at both the tree here and also at the basketball, you can see that there's something up with both of them. So every model and object in this game has two versions of its model. There will be a low detail version and a high detail version. The idea is that when you're close to the object, the high detail version of that model will load in so that you can see it in full detail. And then when the viewer doesn't consider yourself to be close enough to that model, it will load back down to its low detail version. What you need to remember is, even though it looks as if we're close, if you press Ctrl 9 to reset the view angle on a camera, this is actually where a camera is physically positioned on the scene. So if you find yourself having this issue, what you need to do is come up to the main drop down here, into Advanced, and then click Show Debug Settings. And if you take a look in this drop down here, you've got access to all of these different parameters that you can change the value to. But the one that we're interested in is called Render Volume LED Factor. So if you start typing that in, and then you just want to change the value to something higher, so I always like to use 4. And if you take a look, you can see that the tree stopped flickering and this basketball is now showing its high detail. And if I was to zoom out, you can see that everything's loaded in properly as well. So that's everything I wanted to cover with the graphics. So the next thing that I want to show you is backdrops and scenes. So if you're looking for a scene or a backdrop, there's basically two ways that you can do it. So the first method is that you can visit sims in the game that are meant to be photogenic, which is what I've done here, and I'll be leaving a link to this landmark in a pastebin file, and I'll also be putting in some other links as well, such as where you can get backdrops and poses from the marketplace. If you go to the Second Life Destinations page and take a look in the photogenic spots category, you'll find landmarks to all these different sims hosted by other people, and the idea is that you're totally free to walk around these environments and take pictures. The only downside to this is, depending on what the settings are on the sim, you might not have permissions to res or build any objects, which means you won't be able to build any lights or use props. Which brings us to the second method, which is just to go to the marketplace and purchase a backdrop on your own. The downside to this is that obviously it will cost you Linden, and you'll also need to find a sim where you can res the backdrop and have enough space to work with. One place that I would really recommend, and I'll be leaving a link to this in my pastebin, is Backdrop City. In this sim they have all the backdrops that you would get normally on the marketplace, and they have them all just res there, ready for you to use. And the best thing about it, in my opinion, is they do give you permissions to res objects, so you can also use your own lightings and props as well. There's actually one backdrop there that I use quite a lot, and I feel like it would be good to use an example for showing you the next section, which is Wind Lights. So we're here now in Backdrop City, and what I want to show you now is the fixed environment editor in your viewer, also known as your Wind Lights. So the first thing that I'll show you here is down here you have this drop down menu, and you can select from different presets. You'll have system presets here, which are built into the viewer itself, and then as you go down, any custom wind lights that you have in your inventory will show up here. So these are ones that I got from the Fox City main store and the marketplace, and I'll leave a link to that in the pastebin because some of these wind lights are quite nice, although since I'm going to be covering everything one by one, I'll leave this alone for now, and then we'll just go through each element on its own. So this first box here where it says Blue Horizon, if you click into any of these boxes, it's going to bring up your RGB color picker, and Blue horizon just controls the color of your sky. So if I was to change this towards a red color, you can see it's going to become red. If I have it over blue or pink, and then you can adjust how dark or light you want it to be. I just like to have a blue sky most of the time, so I'll set it right around a little bit darker. Something like this should be good. So this next one here, blue density, what that controls is how saturated your sky is. So as we go up the way, it's going to become more and more blank, like there's just no colour. And then as we come back down, you'll see that the colour starts to come back in again, and it gets really deep until you hit the black here, where it just disappears. So I tend to have this quite low because that gives you a really saturated look. So this next box here, ambient, this actually controls two things. So the color here, this will determine, it's almost like a tint where all the colors from your atmospheric lighting are going to have this particular color attached to it. So if you have just white or blank, then all the colors, they're just going to show as they are. But if you apply, let's say green, that's going to give the sort of green tinted filter to it. And then this slider here between white and black, this controls the intensity. So white means that, you know, there's light bouncing off everywhere, and then as we come back down, you can create almost like a very devoid setting where there's no light at all. This slider here where it says haze horizon, what this does is the higher it goes up, that means the higher the haze will be in your scene. So if you can imagine a sunset, if there's a line for the horizon, this will kind of obscure the horizon a bit more, and it will start to accentuate the sun, and it can give off it's almost like a smog-like effect. And then this slider here where it says haze density, this just controls how intense the haze will be. So if you're taking an outdoor picture like this one and you want to have a bright sky with lots of clouds, you want your haze density to be fairly low. And then if you want to have more of a smoggy sort of polluted sky, you will have this turned up quite high. The three values down here for moisture, drop and ice, I've not actually seen these used anywhere, although from what I've read online, I believe these control its parameters for the rainbow. If there's a rainbow in a sim, so I believe moisture will control the intensity of the rainbow, like how much you can see, although this is not something that I've ever used before. The slider here, density multiplier, this basically just controls the density in your atmospheric lighting. So when you have it quite low like this, it gives off this sort of thin air sort of look, and then as it comes up the way, it's more of a smog-like heavy look. Distance multiplier will affect how much of your scene that you can see. So when it's quite low, everything's quite clear, there's nothing obscured, and then as it goes up the way, it's almost like a fog where you can only see a certain radius in front of you. The max altitude slider will change at which point Second Life will calculate that atmospheric lighting. So if it's a daytime scene like this, you can use this to control the brightness almost, and then if it's a later time of the day, like a sunset, you can make the sunset look a bit more colourful and deep at a higher value. Scene gamma will just change how much dark and light input is being used, so the lower this is, everything's going to look pretty dark, and then as it goes higher, it can appear brighter, but if it's too bright, then the colours in the scene start to look really washed out. Going on to the second tab now, we have sun colour, which will just change the colour of the light that's being projected from your sun, and this actually does change the sky colour as well. Where it says sun image, whenever you see this box here with a black cross, when you click this, it will give you the option to upload a custom texture. So you can either upload a texture or you can select the blank button here, and that will set it to a flat colour. Now there's a special use case when you select the sun, because Second Life will throw in this transparent circular graphic that's like a placeholder for the sun that you can use if you want, or you can upload a custom one. Although most of the time I tend not to use a texture for the sun, I like to keep it blank. And if you want to as well, there's a built-in texture for the moon, but you can also swap it out with anything you want basically. So these sliders here where it says sun angle, this will control the direction that the sun's going to face in your scene, and there'll be a tick box here to enable a beacon. So this is kind of like a sundial where you get to see the axis of where your sun is in the scene. Glow focus will affect how much of the sun is blurring the sky, so the lower it goes, the more washed out it's going to appear, and it can even cover up the whole screen. And then the higher it goes, the sun starts to disappear. And glow size will determine the size of your sun image. So for us it's blank, so if you were to turn this all the way up, it will crank out the lighting just ever so slightly, but if you had an image here, it would be scaled a lot higher in the sky. So coming into the clouds tab now, you had the cloud color, which will give you an RGB option, and I like to have this normally just at a pure white or sometimes a grey color for normal clouds. And then you had the option here to upload your own cloud image as well. So these three sliders here will control the X and Y axes of the clouds, so you can reposition them. And then down here you have the density. So a high density will mean that the clouds will look a lot more solid and full, and then as you lower them, I'll just reposition it slightly, as you lower them it will become a bit more wispy and light looking. So these bars here will control the coverage of the clouds, the scale and the variance. So the coverage just means how much of the sky do you want to be taken up by the clouds. You have the scale, which will control the size, and then the variance means how much you want them to break apart. And then you have these two sliders to control the cloud scroll, so you can affect how fast you want the clouds to move on both the X and Y axes. So as you bring it down, they'll move very slowly, and then as you turn it up, they'll move very fast, and you can also lock them in position so that they won't move at all. So that pretty much covers all the lighting in the Winlight settings. So the next thing that I want to show you is how you can set up point lights and projectors. So just to try and explain this a little bit better, I've switched to scene here. So we've just got a really dark environment, and in our Winlights we've got almost everything set to black, and then we're going to change the scene gamma in a second just to make it absolutely pitch black. So the first thing you want to do here is you press Ctrl B to bring up the build tools, and then with this one cursor you want to select the prim. You can do a sphere or a cube, doesn't really matter, and then you click here to build it. And now in the features tab here, the box here where it says light, as soon as you tip that box, this is now a point light. So if we turn the gamma all the way down, you should see that this is now the only light that's in our scene. A point light is basically just flat light, so if I start to move this object around, you'll see that it's starting to illuminate the area around the scene, although it can't actually cast physical shadows like projectors can. The intensity will just change how strong you want the light to be, so by default it will be 1, but if I was to have this to 0.5, you can see that it's casting less light. What the radius determines is how far your light will travel from your print before it starts to blend in with the lighting from your Winlight. So by default we have it at 10, but if you set this to 5, you can see that it's only going to travel about half as far before it starts to blend in with the dark light that we set in our Winlight. And what fall off does is this determines how much decay or how much the light will change over time as it travels from your print into your scene. So if I was to set this to a low value, then what that means is it's going to be a very consistent light. Even if this prim was to be really far away from this floor here, the light strength will be pretty much the same. But if I was to set this higher, what that means is the prim would need to be very close for the light to have any effect. So those are the options for point lights. So the next thing that will show you is how you can turn this into a projector. And just to demonstrate this a bit better, I'll be putting in a separate object, so we'll put in a sphere, and we'll just quickly change the texture to be a blank colour. So the way you create a projector is if you come into your features tab, and then next to your colour box here for the light, you have the texture box. So if you click on this, you can upload a texture, but what I'm going to do is as soon as you click blank here for just a blank colour, straight away your prim is now a projector light. So if I was to rotate this prim here by holding down Control and then click along the axes and drag that you want to rotate, if I start moving this around, you can see now that it's casting a shadow off the sphere. And then if you click on the color box again, you can actually change the color of the projected light. So for example, you could have two projectors, so one here could be set to a red color. And then if you set your second projector to be a sort of blue color, the two will mix together and then you'll get this nice sort of magenta look. So what I normally do is, if I'm taking pictures in an indoor cramped setting like this one, I'll normally just disable my wind light settings and I'll use a combination of point and projector lights to create these sort of shadows. But if I'm taking a picture outdoors in an outdoor scene, then usually I'll just let the wind light handle the lighting for me. So I think at this point we're finally ready to start taking a picture, and this will be a good segue for me to show you how to use the poser in Black Dragon. So we're here again at Backdrop City, and the idea for this picture is going to be quite straightforward. It's just going to be my avatar with a coffee cup in front of these stores. So I'm going to be going through all the steps one by one. So usually the very first thing that I check is my avatar's hover height. So the way you do that in Black Dragon, you can just right click on your avatar and select hover height, and it'll be a slider to control how much your avatar is hovering off the ground. So initially it was like down here, so I want it to be as close to the pavement here as I can. It helps to zoom in a little bit, and one thing I'll mention as well, in Black Dragon, with any slider you can fine tune it by using the arrow keys instead of using the mouse to click and drag. And again, if you right click, that will reset the value. So using the arrow keys, I'll just make sure that this is as close to the pavement as I can, around about here. Once I've done that, the next thing I usually do is set up the pose. This mostly just depends on your idea for the picture, but because this is just meant to be a simple one, instead of using a pose in my inventory, I'll just be using the poses that are built into my animation override. The stance that he's taking just now looks good to me, so the way that you freeze your avatar is with this button up here. When you click on the poser, you'll get this window here, and you'll see that once I click on my name here, all these joints will appear. And once you click on this button here that says start posing, that's going to lock your avatar into that current pose. These three tabs here where it says rotation, position and scale, these will be greyed out, but once you select a joint, you'll be able to click through them. Most of the time it's just the rotation sliders I use, but for certain things you can use position and scale. So for example, with the pelvis, I tend to use position quite a lot because you can see that if I start dragging along here on the y-axis, you can actually move the avatar out the scene. So normally while I'm working on the pose, I like to work on setting up the camera as well. So using the shortcut Ctrl-0, I like to set the angle to zoom in 6 times. And then I'll use Alt left click on my avatar to set the camera on him, and then at this point I'll use the movement keys to set up the frame that I want. So the way that I imagine this picture to be is, I quite like the low angle look that we've got going here. And what I've also done is I've used Alt left click to pan the camera just to the right a little bit, because this is starting to look like a block of streets. And then using the shortcuts that we learned earlier to tilt the camera, Shift E, I'll just get the tilt the way I want it to be. I think this angle looks pretty good, so I'm gonna hit Ctrl Shift C to save the angle. So that way, if I was to start changing the angle, if I mess it up, all I have to do is hit Ctrl Shift V, and that will take me back. The last thing I want to do before we start changing the pose a little bit is I want to make sure that the depth of field is locked onto our avatar, because he does look kind of blurry. So I'll use Alt left click to focus the camera on him, and then using Alt Shift X, that's going to lock the focus. So if I was to reset the angle again, you can see that if I was to change the depth of field really high, our avatar is going to be the focus of the depth of field. So the next thing that I want to do is I want to make sure that I want the eyes to be kind of facing towards the camera. So if I start moving the Z slider here, you can see that the eye, I want him to be kind of glancing towards the camera. And then I'll do the same on the left eye, so something like that. The next thing that I want to do is I like the eyelids to be closed ever so slightly. So if you start to scroll down, you'll find a joint here called the eyelid upper left. So that'll be for the left eye. And on the y-axis, if you turn this up a little bit, you'll see that the eye starts to kind of close. And then I'll just do the same for the right eye here, so around a bit there. And from here it's pretty much just the lights that I want to set up now, so since this is outdoors, all the lighting can be handled by our one light. So what I like to do before I start setting colours and stuff is I'll go into the sun and moon angles and I'll just make sure that the light's being cast in the way that I want to. I'll reduce the altitude just a little bit so that the sun's a little bit stronger. And since we can't see the sky itself, the only thing that we need to change would just be the sun colour. So I like to keep it around this shade here towards a darker colour, and then I think maybe a pink colour. So I would actually say that this picture is pretty much ready because we've gotten the idea across and we've gotten the lighting set up properly. So the next step now is just to take the picture. So if you press Ctrl Shift and S, that's going to bring up the snapshot menu. So if we take a look here, you'll see we'll have a checkbox for both the interface and the HUD, so you can toggle those elements on or off. And when you press Save to Disk, what you'll find down here is you'll have presets for your width and height, and you'll also have this here to allow high resolutions. It's important that you have this ticked, and the format, I like to use PNG, but you can also save it as a JPEG. I'll be showing you how to do some post-edit stuff, so what I tend to do is I'll save the screenshot in 6K, and then once you import it into Photoshop or whatever program you like to use, once you've made your edits and export it back out, you can do that in 4K just to maintain that bit of high definition. Although before we do that, I do want to show you one thing that's to do with the depth of field. It might be hard to see from this angle, but if I was to zoom in towards the hair, what you'll notice is that the depth of field, it's struggling a little bit around the hair. With my hair in particular, it's most noticeable at the very top. Basically the reason this happens is because when Second Life is calculating its depth of field, a lot of hair in Second Life will have these alpha layers that might interfere with it. So even though the front looks pretty crisp, as it works its way up towards this part of the hair, there's like a hidden image here, which is the alpha layer, and then Second Life is running its calculation through that, which is the reason why we're getting these sort of blurry lines. So when Second Life is calculating its depth of field, it's starting here, and then as it works its way up towards the hair, it stumbles across this flat plane here, which is alpha'd. So it's running its depth of field calculations through that, and that's the reason why we get this blurred look. There's actually a clip on Twitter that demonstrates this a lot better than I have by Prime Catboy. He also goes into detail about how to use the cutout method to get around this, and this is actually where I learned the technique from. He also has lots of other helpful stuff on his Twitter, so if Second Life photography is something you like doing, definitely go and check him out. We'll be using the cutout method with this picture to get around this problem with the depth of field, so we'll get started on that now. So the way this works is we're just going to take the photo as we would normally, but one thing we'll change is in our machinima slider, we don't want any depth of field, so we'll turn that all the way down. I'd recommend that you save the camera position for this because the key with this is all three photos need to have the exact same position. So the first picture that I want to take here is just this scene without my avatar. So what we do is in our poser, we select ourselves, then the pelvis, and under position on the y-axis, we'll just drag that across until we're completely out of frame. So when I come back into my snapshot now, it's just the background, and then I'll save this into my folder. And then the next two pictures we're going to take will involve having an avatar behind a completely white and then a completely black background. It's going to look quite weird, but it'll make more sense once we get to the part where we're editing the picture. It's going to be kind of awkward to edit the box from this angle, so I'll just make sure that it's saved by hitting Ctrl Shift C, and then we can start editing the box. So what I do is I'll come into the Object tab, and I like to make sure that Phantom is on so that it doesn't collide with my avatar. And then in Texture, I'll just click the box and set this to a blank colour. And I like to have this box ticked here for full bright. The idea is that once we jump into our full editing program, we want this background to be as close to 255 on the RGB channel as possible. In the RGB channel, 255 is pure white, so that's the reason why we're selecting full bright. And then back in the objects tab where it says hollow, if you start turning this up, that's going to create a hollow box where it's empty on the inside. And then we want to scale it up by using Control Shift. And we want to make sure that it's completely covering that avatar. So if I reset my camera angle here, this looks okay, although we also want to cover the floor as well. So I'll just create a new prim and do that real quick. So something like this is what we're going for. Although you might have noticed that there seems to be a problem with our lighting here. This is just because this prim is actually blocking the atmospheric lighting from coming in. To fix this, all you need to do is edit the prim and then use select face to select these outside faces here. And if you make these outside faces here fully transparent, the Second Life engine will be able to cast light back in again. So it's just a case of selecting each one and making sure that they're fully transparent. Once that's done, if you come back to our camera angle, you can see this looks a lot better. So this should be good enough for the white, so we can go ahead and save that now. And then all we need to do from here is change the color of these prims to black. So taking a look here, this looks pretty good, so we'll save that as well. So that's pretty much everything we need to do in Second Life, so the next step is to load up our images in a photo editing program. So we're here now and I'm using Pixlr to edit these, which is a browser-based program, but if you want to, you can use Photoshop or GIMP. So we're working with 3 layers here. We've got the black backdrop, the white backdrop, and also the scene itself, and each image is on its own layer. And what we want to do is we want to duplicate one of these layers so that the colors alternate. So if I duplicate the white one and then place that on top, we've got white, then black, then white. So on the top layer, what we do is in the blending mode here, we want to set this to difference. So the way difference works is if we take a quick look again at our 2 pictures, the difference blend mode is taking these 2 pictures and anything that's different between these 2 is going to be white, and anything that's completely the same between these 2 pictures, so that'll be our avatar, it's going to be black. And what I like to do is if we select this layer, right click and then merge it down, we're left with just 3 layers. So we've got this layer with the silhouette, this layer with our avatar, and then this layer with our background. So on the layer with our silhouette, we just select the magic wand tool and then click into the area here. And then we just go into our layer below here. And with this selection, now going across our avatar like this, we just want to cut this out. And then if you go into our background layer, we just paste this back in. So now we're left with just our cutout and the background. So the next step from here is to give our background a depth of field effect. So in Pixlr, it will be this focus tool here that we use. So the way I've done it is I have this linear gradient here. So I've dragged the slider up past the canvas and this bar represents the coverage. So this is going to cover the whole picture. And you'll see that if I start turning up the blur here, it will have this depth of field effect. So if we take a look again with our cutout, if we were to zoom in on the hair, you can see that we don't have any weird blurriness going on with the hair and our background looks nice and faded. And what I like to do from here is I'll merge this layer down, so we're left with just this one layer, and if you make a copy of it, this is where you can start doing your more kind of normal adjustments like changing the levels and the colours. From here you can crop it if you want to, so you can give it more like a 4:3 sort of like Instagram crop, but other than that we're pretty much finished. So if you watched this all the way to the end, thank you so much. If Second Life photography is something that you like doing, then I really hope this helped you. Ideally, I want as many people as possible that are interested in Second Life to be watching these kinds of videos, so if you could please subscribe to the channel, that would really help me out with YouTube's algorithm. So once again, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you around.